uh, the point is very, very clear what Esarhaddon is trying to convey. Esarhaddon does quite well for himself. However, like any Mesopotamian king, he again is faced with this problem of succession. In his time, the process of succession, which is supposed to lead to a very easy transition, the selection of a successor, he's raised up within the royal court. He's educated, and he's chosen because he's the most fit to lead. This process breaks down, right, during his lifetime. He had to fight his brother for kingship, and he doesn't want to see the same thing happen again. So Esarhaddon ends up choosing a son to succeed him, and that son that he chooses is Ashurbanipal, who takes over in 668 BCE, and will actually end up being the last real strong king of the Assyrian Empire. But at the same time, he's got another son, an older son by the name of Shamash Shum-ukin. And Esarhaddon decides to do something pretty innovative and maybe even risky. He declares that Ashurbanipal is going to rule Assyria and that Shamash Shum-ukin will rule Babylon, that the two will rule simultaneously. Ashurbanipal will still be in charge, but again, he's handing over what is, in its sense, its own empire to his other son, in the hopes, again, that this will quell any kind of problem, any kind of, confrontation between the brothers, that each will have their own path and will be able to rule together. And in fact, he makes them swear to, an allegiance to each other, and also has all the court swear to uphold this agreement. They all swear a loyalty oath. Ashurbanipal follows in his father's footsteps. He actually ends up putting down a revolt in Egypt. He returns to Egypt after Taharqa takes power again. He's able to put down a revolt. Eventually, he has to withdraw, but Egypt remains friendly to Assyria. And in addition to the military campaigns that Ashurbanipal engages in, we also know that he's quite a scholar in his own right. A lot of the texts that we have from the Neo-Assyrian period come from Nineveh and come from the library of Ashurbanipal. Ashurbanipal viewed himself as sort of a Renaissance man. He was an artist, a scholar, a mathematician. He makes these claims that he could read both Sumerian and Akkadian, the oldest forms of Sumerian, even stuff that came before the flood, supposedly. And there's a tremendous interest in these early texts. Ashurbanipal curates a library of texts that relate to astronomy, to the sciences, of course the archives that record the daily functioning of the Assyrian Empire, but also literary texts. So this is where some of our complete versions of the Epic of Gilgamesh come from, copied and recopied, and then finally making their way into this library of Ashurbanipal. So this library is actually one of the richest sources for a lot of literary traditions that we have. And for 16 years, this situation seems to work out quite well. Ashurbanipal goes on campaign, again annually, keeping Assyria together while his brother rules in the south. But then in 652, trouble breaks out. And this balance of power that Esarhaddon had hoped for begins to break down. Perhaps it was set up for failure to begin with. Maybe this wasn't a very good idea in the first place, taking two sons and putting them in different positions of power, because in 652, again, civil war breaks out. And Shamash Shum-ukin turns against his brother and ends up going against Assyria altogether. The two begin to fight. Shamash Shum-ukin looks for help in the south, and if you're in Babylon, who's your best ally? Who are you going to turn to for assistance against the Assyrian Empire? Who would you side with? Who else is down there to give you assistance? And might be decidedly anti-Assyrian, maybe to the east a bit, east of Babylon. Elamites, exactly. Yeah, that's right. So he actually sides with the Elamites. The Elamites, again, all too happy to turn against Assyria. They end up supporting Shemesh Shumunkin against Ashurbanipal, and the two come into conflict. Eventually, Ashurbanipal wins out, and he ends up deposing his brother and killing him, taking control of the entire region in 648. So we'll come back to that in a little bit, but before we do, I want to take a look at some of the art that comes from Ashurbanipal's reign. Again, not much from Esarhaddon's reign, but during the reign of Ashurbanipal, we see a continuation of these wonderful reliefs in palaces at Nineveh. So at first, Ashurbanipal stays in his father's palace. He stays in the southwest palace at Nineveh and ends up reusing many of the slabs that Sennacherib put in place. And again, remember, this is where the siege of Lachish is, in the center, right, of the palace. And we looked at these reliefs last time. True to form, many of Ashurbanipal's reliefs are of military conquest. And indeed, we actually see the consequences of this civil war and of Ashurbanipal in 648 basically taking over the entire empire, going to the south, burning Babylon, deposing and killing his brother, and also punishing the Elamites that his brother sided with, and particularly one Elamite king by the name of Teumman. So Teumman of Elam, who sided with this brother against him. So, for example, one of the reliefs that we see here is a battle in 653 against Teumman at it's called the Battle of Tiltuba, and it's on the river Ulai. And what we'll do is we'll take a look at this in a bit of depth. Take a look. Again, in 648, following this battle in 648, so this is in 653 and 648, Ashurbanipal would go on to actually take Susa itself and loot Susa and destroy the temples there, carrying off the gods, bringing them back to the Assyrian heartland. So, right, not just the destruction of Babylon, but also the destruction of Susa during this time as well. In fact, he's so intent on sowing destruction and not seeing these problems arise again. We're told that he destroys the city, he sacks the temples, and he actually salts the earth so nothing will grow in Elam ever again. So very kind of severe response. And we see that in the art too. We see that in these narrative depictions of the Battle of Tiltuba. And this very extensive narrative of Assyrian defeat. You can see here that the battle rages from left to right. It starts off in these sort of orderly, what's the word I'm looking for? Sorry, I'm sick. Registers. And then by the time it reaches the river itself, which you can see running here, the scene is complete chaos. It goes from order into total disorder as the Assyrians make their advance on the Elamites, end up defeating them. And we'll look at some of these little narrative scenes in a moment. And then finally, they reach the river. Again, the banks of the river here, one side and the other, which is literally choked with the bodies of the dead and horses and parts, and they're being fed on by fish. So pretty graphic scene, one that's intent to really show, what happens to people that, defy the Assyrian Empire. We can see actually what happens to Teumman himself. We just follow, again, the series of depictions, and similar to Sennacherib, Ashurbanipal uses these compositions, right, this same perspective, this bird's eye view, with the inclusion of small inscriptions to describe exactly what's taking place here. So what we see in a series of events from this palace, or from these inscriptions, are the chariot with the team of horses, and Teoman and his son falling out. So all of these slaughtered troops, of course, are Elamites. We don't have dead Assyrians. We would never depict such a thing. But we see Teoman and his crown prince falling out of their chariot, this Ben-Hur style chariot wreck as they spill out. A little bit farther down, again, another narrative scene as we see what takes place after both Teoman and the crown prince. Here's Teoman lying down, the crown prince who is being smacked on the head as he watches his father actually being beheaded by an Assyrian soldier. Is being held down by these others. And then actually finally we have examples of this head being carried. In fact, this head, we're told, went on a traveling tour at the end of this battle. The head was brought city to city to city and displayed just, so these kings, of these tributaries would know this is the price for insubordination. The head of Teoman. And we'll come back to that head in a moment. In addition to these scenes of warfare, we have scenes of daily life, if you will, the sort of garden party of Ashurbanipal. We'll take a look at this scene. Again, we looked at this before mainly because of the furniture. We were looking at the inlaid furniture, this ivory inlaid furniture, again coming from the west, coming from Phoenicia. Again, these goods, we see Ashurbanipal at rest in this garden, this lovely garden, under a bower of grapes, sipping wine. There's a wine bowl, sipping wine with one of his queens. We've got incense burners to purify the air. We've got attendants who are whisking away flies. Other attendants bringing food and delicacies, whisking away the wines, birds in the trees. And then we come upon this very strange thing. This wonderful sort of idyllic scene, which for all intents and purposes seems to be, again, a garden party. We follow Ashurbanipal's gaze across the wine bowl, straight out to the trees, and we come to this. Anybody want to take a stab at what that is? Zoom in on it. Yeah, that's the head. This is where the head ends up. After its world tour, it's actually, in this case, strung on a tree where it can be picked apart by the birds. So this depiction, again, is quite shocking, right? We see one thing, we expect it, and then all of a sudden you look and this kind of horrific addition to this scene is very, very, very striking. And again, it seems to actually be quite intent. It actually is intentional. When we look at Elamite iconography, and we see some of the scenes used in Elamite cylinder seals and also in other forms of representational art, the grape bower, right, with this is an Elamite cylinder seal, you can see here again the similarities in composition. These grapes hanging down, and this sort of upper figure and lower figure. Essentially what I'm trying to say is that this is an Elamite scene that Ashurbanipal is actually appropriating for the purposes of driving the point home, right? He's taking what